Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to do a deep dive into Alfred Korzybski's Science and Sanity.
Oh, yeah. Science and Sanity.
This book, first published in 1933, really sets out to explore, I think, this really interesting relationship between the words we use and the thoughts we think
Right.
and how we ultimately behave. It's kind of like a user manual for the human mind.
It is, and it's a manual that's had a pretty huge impact. I mean,
Yeah,
Korzybski went on to found the Institute of General Semantics based on these ideas, so, it's not just some, light reading.
definitely not light reading, but I think that's why we have you here.
That's right.
One of the things that struck me right away was the dedication
Oh, yeah.
to the works of Aristotle, Einstein, Whitehead, which have greatly influenced my inquiry. The system is dedicated. That's quite the lineup.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I think it shows just how far-reaching Korzybski's thinking was. I mean, he's drawing on philosophy, physics, mathematics.
Mm,
He's not afraid to kind of, like, cross these disciplinary boundaries,
yeah,
to get to the heart of how we understand the world.
totally. And that really gets to the core of what he's trying to do, right?
Yeah.
He wants to bridge this gap between all the advancements in science and how we're actually living our lives. He even suggests that understanding these principles can help us live more, uh, you know, sane lives.
Right.
I don't know about you, but in today's world, a little more sanity sounds pretty good.
Yeah, I think we could all use a dose of that. And, Korzybski's approach is particularly relevant now,
Yeah.
when we're bombarded with information from all sides, and it's harder than ever to know what to believe.
Totally. Okay,
Right.
so let's unpack some of these ideas. Korzybski talks about this concept of time binding as something unique to humans. He says it's what separates us from animals and has allowed us to build on the knowledge of past generations.
It has, but, think about how that plays out in our world today.
Yeah,
With the rise of social media and the constant flow of information, both true and false.
right.
We're constantly copying information, just like Korzybski describes. But are we doing it critically? Are we evaluating the sources, considering the biases, questioning the underlying assumptions?
That's a really interesting point. So this time binding thing, while being a key to our progress, can also lead us down some pretty tricky paths if we're not careful. It's almost like a responsibility
It is.
that comes with being human.
Exactly. And that's where Korzybski's ideas about general semantics come in.
Okay.
He's not just pointing out the problem, he's offering a solution. He describes general semantics as this new extensional discipline. Now, I know that sounds a bit jargony.
It does, yeah.
But what he means is that it's a way of thinking that's grounded in the real world, in observable facts and experiences, rather than these abstract ideas that might not actually reflect reality.
So it's less about getting lost in theories and more about connecting our thoughts to what's actually happening around us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Precisely. And, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Korzybski argues that we need to move away from what he calls Aristotelian systems of thought,
Yeah.
which he saw as being too limited, too black and white, to really deal with the complexities of the modern world.
Okay, so hold on. What exactly does he mean by Aristotelian systems? I'm going to confess my philosophy classes are a bit of a blur at this point. Can you just break that down for us?
Yeah, of course. So Aristotelian systems are basically built on this idea that everything fits into these neat categories.
Okay.
That A is A and can never be B. It's a very either way of thinking. And while that approach works for some things, Korzybski felt it just wasn't sophisticated enough to deal with the nuances of human behavior, psychology, and this ever-changing world around us.
So what does he propose instead? What's the alternative to this either-or thinking?
He calls it a non-Aristotelian orientation, and it's all about recognizing the fluidity and interconnectedness of things. To illustrate this, he actually includes a really helpful table in the book that compares these two orientations across different aspects. For example, an Aristotelian approach sees mind and body as separate entities, while a non-Aristotelian approach emphasizes their interconnectedness.
So it's less about putting things into boxes and more about understanding how they relate to each other and,
Yeah,
constantly influence one another.
exactly. And he even argues that this Aristotelian system is, like, baked into our language,
Oh, wow.
leading us to make what he calls misevaluations that can impact our mental well-being and our ability to solve problems effectively. He refers to these as neurosemantic and neurolinguistic factors.
Wait, so our language itself is actually messing with our ability to think clearly. Tell me more about that.
Well, Korzybski argues that the structure of our language, often leads us to oversimplify things, to ignore the complexities and the shades of gray that exist in reality. And this can have real-world consequences, impacting everything from our personal relationships to how we approach global issues.
That reminds me of a point he makes about the multiordinality of terms,
Right.
where the meaning of a word can change depending on the context.
Yes, and he illustrates this with a really clever example using the word barber. Imagine a barber who shaves all men who don't shave themselves.
Oh,
The question is, does he shave himself?
ooh, that's tricky. If he does, then he shouldn't, but if he doesn't, then he must. It's like a mental pretzel.
Exactly. And that's precisely his point. Words like barber, or any word for that matter, can have different meanings depending on the level of abstraction.
So context is key. We can't just assume that everyone is using words in the same way or that words always have this fixed absolute meaning.
Right. And this awareness of the limitations of language is crucial for avoiding misunderstandings and what Korzybski calls semantic blockages.
Okay.
Basically, those mental roadblocks that prevent us from seeing things clearly and finding effective solutions.
So are you saying that our language can actually prevent us from being sane?
Well, it's not that simple, of course.
Yeah.
But Korzybski definitely believed that the way we use language can contribute to psychological distress and prevent us from reaching our full potential as individuals and as a society.
Okay, wow. This is already a lot to think about.
Right.
And we're just, scratching the surface here. But I think we've got a good foundation for understanding where Korzybski is coming from and why his ideas are still so relevant today. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really excited to, dig deeper into some of his key concepts like time binding and non-Aristotelian systems and explore how we can apply them to our own lives.
Me too. There's so much more to uncover in science and sanity, and I have a feeling it's going to challenge us to think in entirely new ways.
I wouldn't have it any other way. Welcome back, everyone.
So before we left off, we were talking about how our language can actually create these semantic blockages that prevent us from seeing things clearly.
Right. And Korzybski actually goes a step further. He says that these blockages can actually hinder our progress as a society and even contribute to conflict and suffering.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is. It is. But he backs it up with, some pretty compelling arguments. He points to the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century
Right.
and how they use propaganda and this manipulation of language to control people's thoughts and actions.
So he's saying that these dictatorships were able to thrive because they exploited these inherent flaws in our thinking.
Exactly. Yeah. They tapped into our tendency to think in black and white terms, to oversimplify these, complex issues,
Right.
and to blindly follow these authority figures without questioning the underlying assumptions.
And this all ties back to his idea of a science of man, right?
Right.
This grand vision of understanding human behavior in a more comprehensive and scientific way.
Yes, Korzybski believed that by applying the principles of general semantics, we could create a more accurate and effective science of man, one that would encompass everything from psychology and sociology to education and politics.
So it's not just about individual sanity.
Right.
It's about creating a more sane and functional society as a whole.
Precisely, yeah. He saw general semantics as this tool for social change,
Yeah.
for breaking down those barriers of misunderstanding and creating a more peaceful and just world.
I have to admit, some of the stuff in science and sanity gets pretty complex. He goes into all this stuff about non-Euclidean geometry and the differential calculus, which honestly went a bit over my head.
I hear you. It can definitely get dense at times.
Yeah.
But the key takeaway for me is that, Korzybski is trying to show how even mathematics,
Yeah.
which we often think of as being purely objective and logical, can be influenced by our assumptions and the way we structure our thinking.
So even in something as seemingly straightforward as math, there's still room for interpretation and potential for misevaluation.
Exactly, yeah. And that's why he emphasizes the importance of structure. He argues that by understanding the underlying structure of a system, whether it's a language, a scientific theory, or even a human relationship, we can gain a deeper understanding of how it works and avoid those pitfalls of misinterpretation.
As we're talking, I'm realizing just how far-reaching Korzybski's ideas are. I mean, they challenge us to rethink our whole approach to knowledge,
They do.
to be more critical of our own assumptions, and to be more mindful of how our language shapes our reality.
And ultimately to take more responsibility for the
Right.
way we communicate and interact with the world around us.
Speaking of communication, I'm curious, how Korzybski would view our current state of affairs. I
Right.
mean, we live in a world of information overload where everyone has a platform to share their opinions, and it seems like there's more division and polarization than ever before.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to consider. And I think Korzybski would be both fascinated and concerned by the way we're using language and technology today.
Okay.
I mean, he would probably see the potential for both great progress and great harm.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure.
Okay.
So on the one hand, the internet has made information more accessible than ever before,
Right.
which could be seen as a positive development,
Right.
in terms of time binding.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's also created these echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing biases.
And that can lead to those semantic blockages we were talking about earlier, right? Where
Yeah.
people become so entrenched in their own worldview that they're unable to see other perspectives or
Mhm.
engage in meaningful dialogue.
Exactly. And I think Korzybski would be particularly concerned about the rise of what we now call fake news and the spread of misinformation online. He saw firsthand how propaganda and manipulation of language could be used to control people's minds. And, I'm sure he would see parallels in today's world.
It makes you wonder what he would say about social media algorithms, that seem designed to keep us hooked on content that triggers our emotions and reinforces our existing beliefs.
He'd probably say, it's a prime example of how technology can be used to exploit those, inherent flaws in our thinking,
Right.
those tendencies towards oversimplification and emotional reactivity that he warned us about.
So what can we do about it? I mean, is there any hope for navigating this, complex information landscape
Yeah.
without falling prey to these traps?
I think, Korzybski would say that the first step is awareness. We need to become more conscious of our own thinking processes,
Okay.
of the assumptions we're making, the biases we hold, and the limitations of language itself.
So it's not just about being critical of the information we're consuming, but also about being critical of our own minds.
Exactly. And that's where general semantics comes in. It's not a magic bullet,
Right.
but it offers a set of tools and principles for thinking more clearly, communicating more effectively, and navigating the world with greater awareness and sanity.
Okay, that sounds promising, but I have to be honest, I'm still struggling a bit with the whole concept of non-Aristotelian thinking.
Yeah.
Can we go back to that table you mentioned earlier? I think seeing those specific examples might help me understand it better.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's worth taking a closer look at those distinctions because they really get to the heart of Korzybski's approach.
Great, let's do it. Welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
So before we left off, we were talking about the potential of Korzybski's ideas to create positive change in the world. I'm kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are on how general semantics is actually being applied in different fields today.
Well, one area where it's had a significant impact is in psychotherapy. Many therapists have incorporated Korzybski's principles into their practice to help clients identify and challenge those, negative thought patterns and semantic blockages that we've talked about.
Right.
They contribute to anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues.
So it's about helping people become more aware of the language they're using internally and how that language might be shaping their emotional state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just about changing the words we use, but also about changing the underlying assumptions and beliefs that those words represent.
That makes a lot of sense. What about education? I know Korzybski was a big advocate for educational reform. How are his ideas being used in schools?
Well, there's a growing movement to incorporate critical thinking and media literacy into the curriculum,
Right.
and general semantics provides a really solid framework for doing that. It
Hmm.
teaches students to be more discerning consumers of information, to question assumptions, and to think for themselves.
That sounds incredibly valuable, especially in today's world where, kids are bombarded with information from all sides.
It is. And it's not just about teaching kids how to think critically about the information they're receiving,
Right.
but also about how to communicate more effectively and respectfully with others who might have different perspectives.
So it's about fostering those skills of empathy and dialogue that are so essential for a healthy society.
Exactly. And I think Korzybski would be delighted to see how his ideas are being used to empower young people to become more conscious and responsible citizens.
Beyond psychotherapy and education, what other areas are you seeing general semantics being applied?
Oh, well, it's also being used in fields like business, leadership, conflict resolution, and even personal development. People are using these principles to improve their communication skills, enhance their creativity, and become more effective leaders.
So it's really a versatile set of tools that can be applied to all sorts of challenges and contexts.
It is. And I think that's one of the things that makes Korzybski's work so enduring, It's not a rigid dogma,
Right.
but a flexible and adaptable approach to thinking and problem solving.
Okay, so we've talked about the applications of general semantics, but what about Korzybski's legacy as a whole? How do you think he'll be remembered in the years to come?
Well, I think he'll be remembered as this, visionary thinker who challenged us to rethink our relationship with language and to recognize the power of words to shape our reality. I mean, he was ahead of his time in many ways, and I think his ideas are only becoming more relevant as we grapple with the challenges of the 21st century.
I agree. It's amazing to think that a book written nearly a century ago can still feel so fresh and insightful.
It is. And I think his legacy is still unfolding as more and more people discover his work and find new and creative ways to apply his principles.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by the sense of hope and possibility that Korzybski's work offers. It's easy to get discouraged by the state of the world, but his ideas remind us that we have the power to change things for the better.
I think that's a beautiful takeaway. His work is a call to action, to become more conscious, more critical, and more responsible for the way we think and communicate.
And ultimately, to use our words and actions to create a more sane and humane world.
Precisely.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey into the world of science and sanity.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I always enjoy exploring these ideas with you.
And to all our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more about Alfred Korzybski and the power of general semantics.
Remember, the way we think and communicate shapes our reality. So let's choose our words wisely and use them to create a world we can all be proud of.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.